Welcome everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here in the city of Bendigo. We're meeting on Dyerson and Dyerson country, and since we was never ceded, we want to acknowledge the continuing custodianship of the land and to pay respects to elders past and present. We'd also like to welcome any First Nations people that might be either here with us today or perhaps watching us on Zoom. We have a decent audience, I think, joining us online today. There's about 7 people.
We've got 40 so far and more on the way.
Yep. Registered, but yeah, thanks so much for joining us, whether you're here in beautiful Bendigo or joining us online wherever you are in the world. My name is Dr. Emma Robertson, and I'm an Associate Professor of History at the Bendigo campus of La Trobe University. And it's a great pleasure to be continuing the Discovering History seminar series, which is a partnership with La Trobe and Goldfields Library and Bendigo Regional Archives, and also the Chinese Museum here in Bendigo. So it's a really great pleasure, particular pleasure today to introduce my colleague, Associate Professor Charles Faye. I always say the name, I'm sorry, Charles, this is the Yorkshire version of Faye. But Charles Faye is a great colleague of mine. I've known for 11 years since I've been in Australia. He's now enjoying the joys of retirement, but he is definitely not relaxing and is still very busy researching in the archives. Charles is now an honorary at Bendigo campus, but he's covered widely on Australian rural life, on industrial history. I just worked with him on the Brighton May factory in Melbourne. He's published a book on the history of Mali with colleagues at La Trobe. And he's also currently working as a heritage consultant as well. So it's not resting on his laurels at all. And despite being an now teetotaler, his title on the paper today is Wearing My Boots and Drinking My Whiskey. I will hand over to Charles now. Thanks so much. Excuse me. Oh, is it possibility of is that a bit too bright? So we're just going to adjust the lighting here before we start. Better? Yeah, I think that's well, it's still okay. I think it's all right, Charles.
You can't see.
I think you do it here, but down a bit.
Look, I'll do it. I'll do it, man.
He doesn't need the script. He's a professional.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. The talk, can you hear me? Oh, everybody is it?
Yep.
The talk I'm giving today is part of a bigger project. What I'm trying to do, and I should have done it years ago, is write a social history of Bendigo. I don't sort of want to write a history of, I want to write a history of what happened to the people who came to this community. And I think in Bendigo, we're incredibly blessed by having some wonderful personal accounts of living in the goldfield in the 19th and early 20th century. And today, I'm going to introduce one of those characters that tells us so much about Bendigo. And the talk I give today is my plan for the book sort of basically looks at the development of the goldfield up until about 1880, and then looks at the decline to 1914. So I want to look at the rise and fall of the Australian mining community. And the chapter, the paper today is part of a chapter on housing and home in the second half of that story. And the character that sort of looms large in that story is a gentleman by the name of Isaac Edward Dyerson, who you'll see later on. I'll just going to give you some preliminaries before I start. I think that architectural historians have been looking at housing, I think, for almost 50 years now, since the first Heritage Commission studies in the 1970s. But I think what heritage architects have done is they've looked most, I suppose, intensely at middle class housing, and they've looked at the villas that tend to dominate in the sort of centre of Bendigo, but you'll also see them on the outskirts. Buildings like the one I've just shown you there attract the attention of architects as working class housing, what they call patronising, I think, vernacular architect, because they have some interesting form of construction. So you can see in this case it's sort of built of stone. Architects tend to in looking at the heritage of Bendigo, have tended to neglect the most common form of housing in the community, which was the weatherboard cottage, and I'm going to say a little bit about that today. I think that sort of attention only on middle class housing has changed a lot, and I think one of the people responsible for that is a person I work with nowadays quite a bit, Mandy Jean, a heritage architect. And I suppose about 10 years ago, she did a wonderful survey of the housing in the Iron Park area. Okay, so we're going to go into the houses today, but I think just to give you some sort of background, I think to understand Bendigo in the 19th century, we've got to understand a number of factors about it. First of all, it's a mining community, which is obvious, but mining communities are based on, I suppose, what we call diminishing assets. And the sort of long story of the long 19th century in Bendigo is that they're mining something which is constantly declining, which I think leads to problems. And you can see here, I think it's the grey line that indicates profits. You can see that profits are on a long-term secular decline. You know, from the very moment they entered the first open cut to the First World War. And this, I've argued before, leads to exploitative forms of employment, but it also leads, I think, to a great uneasiness amongst the middle class of a place like Bendigo. I've got the next slide, which is my rogues gallery. It basically lists some of the men who did, and it's only men I should add, who did particularly well out of gold mining. And I think for many of these men, once they'd sort of made their piles, part of the problem is trying to hold on to that money. These are the guys that I've identified, and to give a bit of perspective, I've also put some mining fortunes in from Ballarat and a few other places. One of the reasons I put Ballarat is I love Bailey, Weeping Bailey, which is, his story is a great one, but we'll leave that for the time being. These men, having made their fortunes, I suppose part of the problem was to try and hang on to those fortunes, and if you stayed in mining, that became a problem. What mining also does, I think, is at the beginning, up until about 1881, it fosters the development of outside industries, but those industries never really get a sort of dominant hold in Bendigo. And from the late 1880s, the attempt to industrialise the city doesn't really work. And by the early 20th century, many Bendigo businessmen are getting quite hysterical about the drift to Melbourne of industries. Now, housing, I think, plays an incredibly important part in understanding a mining community. And housing is absolutely essential. I mean, the ability to house a community in the space of time that it takes in Bendigo is quite an achievement, I think. But housing obviously has the importance of providing a shelter over one's head. But in a place like Bendigo, I think housing takes on an added importance. Housing in many ways can be an escape from the sort of detritus of mining. A good garden is a place where you can escape good solid housing, gets you away from the heat of the community. So I'll just give you an overview of some aspects of housing. In the next slide, I think this slide actually sort of tells us a great deal about Bendigo. What you can see there is an attempt I've made to look at the social structure of Bendigo from the rate books. One of the great problems for an Australian historian is the census simply didn't record occupations after 1871. So here I've used the rate books. And the important point, I think, is to note that this is possibly one of the most working class communities in the Australian colonies. I mean, I suspect that there was nowhere else in Australia for most of the 19th century where there was such a concentration of steam machinery. But you can see from this chart that mining is, throughout the course of the 19th century, in a sort of a situation of decline. Now, how do we look at housing? I think one way we can look at housing is through the rate books. And what I've tried to do is to use rate books to look at housing, but I've tried to combine these with a record called the assessment books. And a number of years ago, some assessment books were found in the what was supposed to be the clock tower of the town hall, covered in the most noxious sort of pigeon book, but nonetheless, if you look carefully at that table there, you'll see that there are certain things that we can get from the assessment books that we can't get from the rate books. And to me, the most important two factors there is that the the assessment books give a number of people living in each house, and they also identify whether the housing was a miner's residence area, which I'll talk about later on. And I should add that from about 1913, all rate books carry that extra bit of information. Now, housing, in a sense, allows us to look at the top and the bottom of Bendigo's society. And you can see from this chart that at the bottom of that society, if we look at the net annual value of houses, net annual value is the value that a house would get if it was let out. And you'll see at the bottom of that, I suppose, chart, you'll see the poor, humble miner. The net annual value of mining houses in 1891 was about £12 per annum. And you'll see as we go up the sort of social scale, it increases when we move into the white collar occupations, professional, business and gentlemen. Women are quite interesting in this chart because you'll see that there's a sort of mixture of housing up for women. So the average is almost 23, the median is 14. What that indicates that women often occupied after the death of their husbands' properties. Now, I think understanding housing in Bendigo is we've got to sort of appreciate the way the city was subdivided and the way the city was sold. The first surveys of Bendigo basically set aside certain areas for residential and commercial purposes, and you can see on this general map of Sandhurst, you can see where by the late 1850s, residential areas had been surveyed and commercial areas had been surveyed. But you'll notice outside those areas, there are areas that have not been surveyed, areas that were still at this stage considered auriferous, and the Crown was reluctant to separate itself from the ownership of those areas. and you can see this here. I think you can see Berkeley Terrace, which is a sort of one of Bendigo's finest streets, I suppose. But just at the back of Berkeley Terrace, you've got Iron Bark Gully, which was one of the most intensively mined areas. And so what happens basically is in those areas where it was considered auriferous, rather than initially subdivide the land for sale by auction, they basically allowed the miners, as part of the miners' right of the 1850s, but then the 1860 Mine Land Act, to live on Crown land. And my calculation is that by 1866, just before the great boom in quartz reefing, something like 80% of miners lived on Crown land. And I've got another picture here so you can see the centre of the city. Okay, now I think what this, just to give you some sense of the sort of differing styles of housing, what I've tried to do in my work is as well as using rate books, I've tried to use probate inventories. And if you match the probate inventories, you get a description of the house and you'll get the net annual value. So what I've tried to do is to give you some indication of the sorts of houses that people were living in. So here's a lovely little miner's cottage just near the Garden Gully hockey pitch, which has recently been quite lovingly renovated. A house on a miner's residence area. As I said, in 65, people could build a house on Crown land, but they had no security of tenure. They had to pay their miner's residence every year. In 1882, through until about 1912, a whole series of legislation makes that Crown land more, I suppose, closer to freehold. And the introduction of the Miners' Residence Act of 1881 allows people to let out their houses, allows them to own more than one residence area. Excuse me. It allows them to own the improvements on that block, and eventually it just becomes like freehold. So on a miner's residence area, you can see the cheapest form of housing. And you can see from this slide, I've tried to locate where those residences are from the 1891 rate books or assessor books, and you can see that those residence areas are basically found on the western side of the city where mining took place, although there is a fair concentration of them on the eastern, or sort of in Sandhurst East, where a lot of alluvial mining took place up until the 1860s. So moving up the social scale, the typical miner's cottage is a sort of gable structure. When we move up to weatherboard houses with hip roofs, we're moving into the sort of area of about, I suppose, 18 to 20 pounds annually. You know, the basic form here is a 4-room house with a kitchen out the back. And then moving up the scale again, we get your sort of classic Bendigo brick villa, probably rated at about 30 to 35 pounds per annum. Not much different in size than the weatherboard hipped house, but has that brick structure. And you can see from this slide the distribution of land or house values in Bendigo. And I think one of the interesting things about Bendigo as a city in the 19th century is that the sort of, I suppose, the wealthiest part of the city is the inner area. You can see Sandhurst Central has the highest values there, and Darling also has high values. So what the centre of the city is where the government had subdivided land, sold it for auction, And I think it's also interesting, in the centre of the city, we get a very sort of interesting mix of residential and commercial buildings. You know, some of the biggest manufacturing works were in the centre of the city. And moving up the scale, we get to the house of my friend Conrad Hines. We'll come back to him in a sec. I'll say more about the house later on, but you can see that when we get into that sort of £80 annually, we're getting into quite elaborate, quite spacious, quite solid housing. Okay, so let's now move from looking at the outside of houses and let's enter some houses. I think in the 19th century, children stayed at home, and I'm going to have to qualify this in a sec. Children stayed at home until they married, and early on in their marriage years, they set up a household. Bendigo is different in the sense that so many young men in the 19th century leave home in their early 20s to find opportunities in other mining communities. But by and large, houses are something that people take on when they marry. Now, in the 19th century, there was a great debate in Australia about what was the proper time to marry. And the proper time to marry for a good, respectable man was when you had enough money to support your wife. And to support your wife in a respectable sort of way, with a good house, all the rest of it. In the case of the sort of major banks at issue, you couldn't marry in certain cases until you reached a salary of about £200 to £250 a year. It was considered, if you're a bank teller and maybe you got married a bit young and you were sort of dealing with checks and you had a sort of wife who was a bit free with money, you might be tempted to defalcate the bank's funds. I once remember sort of going through the records of the Bank of Australasia, and they had these wonderful personal records. And there's one bank official who was asked to resign in the early 1890s because he married without permission on too low a salary. And it's quite interesting that 10 years later, the bank officials had pasted on his personnel record that marriage had ended in divorce. In the case of Bendigo, the proper time to marry, amongst some of the rogues I put up before, was, there was a custom amongst some of those great Bendigo gold barons to live with what, let's call them, their housekeepers. George Lancel was well into his 40s before he married. John Boyd Watson, the richest of them all, only married, I think it was Anne Covell, after the birth of his third child, and his third child was a son, so he decided to legitimise it then. A guy like Joseph Bell, delayed marriage until he had sufficient money from his mines, and unfortunately that marriage ended very quickly because his wife died in childbirth. I'm really pushing for time. I've got to put my skates on. Now, looking at the whole concept of the right time to marry, I think we get this very well with my next friend, Isaac Dyerson. Isaac Dyerson was born in Kent, and I've never been able to work out whether he knew Lancel and Kent, but they knew each other very quickly when they came to Bendigo in the 1850s. Now, Isaac Dyerson always worried that he leaves home very early. He leaves home in his, I think, his late teens, and he always blames the fact that he had to leave his home on his father, who was a bathing machine owner in Margate, or Ramsgate, one of those two places. And he said his father married too young and was burdened with a large family. So Dyerson, I think, worries constantly about getting married. He has a few relationships with women that never work out. He never gets married. But in 1876, for the first time, he finds a sort of permanent job. I mean, the guy made a lot of money in the 1850s and basically didn't work for about 20 years. But in 1876, he takes over Lancell's businesses when Lancell is going back home, and he attends a ball. And again, I think this tells us a lot about social life in Bendigo. He's very reluctant to go to this ball because it's a banker's quadrille, and he knows that they'll accept him in 1876 because he's Lancell's manager, but when Lancell comes back, he'll be sent to the back of the hall, so to speak. So he's reluctant to sort of be with the bankers. But he does go to a dance, and he meets what he says. He says, I had a tumble in the waltz, but I met a nice young widow. And that young widow, the Sunday after the ball, comes to Fortuna, finds Dyerson, quote, all dishabille in the garden, and he sort of suggests that she doesn't want to let the sort of grass grow under her feet, but she wants, I think she just wanted to look at Fortuna. Now, they have a relationship from 1876 to when they marry in 1881, and at the back of Dyerson's, I suppose, hopes and aspirations is his worry about having to support children. But he also has his doubts about Harriet Eastwood. I'll show you a picture of young Harriet. And he says of Harriet that she was, quote, not well mannered or cultured enough even for me, better suited to a draper or a tailor. But eventually, when George Lancell decides to go overseas for the second time, Dyerson takes over his affairs, moves into Fortuna. He's a bit annoyed with Lancell because Lancell locks up all the best furniture, but anyway. But when Lancell's off to England for the second time, Dyerson just decides that he can afford to marry Harriet, and in preparation to marriage, he goes out and gets a frock coat, and he says, the first in my life, think I can afford it. And this, of course, is a symbol of a gentleman. And of his wedding, he says, he goes to the Anglican Church, St. Paul's. He's not a normal member of St. Paul's Church, but he says, he fixed the time of marriage at 11 a.m, gave my age as 48. I think that's about right. Gave him the minister £5, as much as I can afford. Felt hitherto as I would like to escape affair, unsuitability and all that, but I wish now it were over. I think and hope it will be all for the best. Wish I could afford a good wedding. Must, with God's help, try and be a good husband and a father, if it be so. And he does marry Edith, and I think it becomes a very successful marriage. We'll see some parts where it has its trials. So Dyerson gets married at 48, which is fairly old to get married, but there is a class distinction in the marriage ages in Bendigo in the 19th century. In the 1880s, the average age for sort of professionals, white-collar employees and businessmen was about 30 years, whereas for miners it was just over 25. So there is this sort of difference. Part of that's to do with the fact that I think some of those business class, like Dyerson, actually are outliers and delay their marriage longer than most. For women, the difference in age between the wives of the middle class and the wives of working miners is quite small. The wives of the middle class probably married at about 22, whereas miners' wives are about 22. Okay, now I think one of the things about life in Bendigo houses in the 19th century is that they were crowded places and that childbirth came very quickly after marriage, in a sort of pre-contraceptive age. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. On New Year's Day 1882, less than 2 months before the birth of his first child, Isaac Dyerson pondered, quote, "Another year begun. What will it bring forth? Children perhaps, doubts, distress perhaps. Hope poor little wife may not suffer too much with child." 2 months later, on the evening of the 22nd of February, Harriet's labour commenced, and at 9 p.m. Dyerson went for the doctor. And he wrote, "Anxious time to 12:30. Daughter safely born. Saw them at once. Wife happy and comfortable. Said our prayers together on the veranda at 9 a.m. Kissed her, took leave. Couldn't keep back the sobs when I heard her moans under chloroform and the baby's wail. At last, I sank, relieved to know." Several months later, he christened his first daughter, Emily, and the remaining children followed, as we would expect for the 19th century, in rapid succession. Amy was born in 1884, Clarence Edward, fascinating character, in 1886, and Cyril in 1888. All these children were born in Fortuna. And again, that's one of my points, is that the house in the 19th century is a place where most people were both conceived and, of course, born. Now, childbirth is obviously a time of great distress for families, great worry about what's going to happen. Maternal mortality rates were quite high, and even the fourth birth, in the case of the Dyerson family, brings out great fears in Dyerson. He said, "About 11 p.m, the nurse came in to say I had another son. All well, thank God. It is over, so well. Saw Harriet shortly after. Well, but for weakness and pains. Largest baby yet, and easiest confinement. Thank Dr. Boyd and Mrs. Ray, his sister-in-law, we'll see her in a sec, all over and in bed by 1 p.m. Emily coughing badly. Always dreaded this confinement, which is now safely over." Okay, well, I think in the case of the Dyerson diary, we can see another trend taking place in 19th century Australia. Excuse me. Demographers have talked about what they call fertility transition. And that's a transition from high levels of fertility and high levels of mortality to high levels, or to lower levels of lower levels of fertility and lower levels of mortality. And in the case of Bendigo, in 1891, marital fertility, that's the fertility of women within marriage, was 8.6 children per married woman. This is a fair bit lower than Melbourne, where fertility decline had started a bit earlier, and in 1891 the marital fertility in Melbourne is only 6.4. Okay, we know from the Dyerson diary that he was very concerned about further confinements, and he wrote in September 1888, "Wife not very well, monthly illness returning, and baby only 6 months old. Must endeavour not to have any more, or she'll be worn out." Now, in his diary, he's coy about what form of contraception they use, but I think, like most people in this first stage of fertility transition, abstinence was the main thing, and we know from the diary he often slept apart from his wife. If we sort of go down the social scale, I think miners are much slower to adapt fertility decline. And what I've been able to work, and it's very hard to get sort of accurate statistics because of the problems of the census, but even as late as 1900, about the average number of children born in mining families for men aged 40 to 49 was 6 children. So families are still large. Okay. Having sort of noted that fertility transition is occurring, I think for most people in the 19th century, large families were the norm. No matter what your class was, no matter what your ethnic status was. I mean, there's no difference between Catholics and Protestants. So that large families are a part and parcel of life and a parcel of living in houses. What I think both the middle class and the working class share in common is deadly pathogens that take the life of children are everywhere, and both the rich and the poor suffer from childhood illnesses. In the 1860s, something like a quarter of all children born in Bendigo died before their first year. Even as late as 1891, it's still 150 deaths per 1,000 births, and it drops dramatically in the early 20th century. To give you some sense of what this could mean for a family, I've been looking at the work of the family of Thomas Harvey, and he registered the birth of his and Eliza's last child, Ernest, in 1882. And in listing his children on the birth certificate, Thomas recorded 5 living children and a staggering 6 dead children. 2 years later, tragedy struck once again when the son, William Thomas, died, aged only 5. Now, the ineffable sadness that comes from childhood deaths, I think we can see from the Dyerson diary. In January 1891, 3 of Dyerson's children came down with a fever, and the disease started with their eldest son, Clarence, who had, according to Dyerson, who had an attack of fever begun with Monday's sunstroke. 2 days later, Clarence was lying, this is the baby, was lying patiently, but was as hot as fire. They consult the doctor. He's not able to do much. Jane Ray, who's the sister of Harriet, works around the clock to try and keep these children alive. And I sort of cut to the chase. In the end, Cyril dies. And Dyerson writes, "My poor baby's sinking, I fear. Pray God spare him. Office till 9:10 a.m. Old chum meetings, nothing good. Calls. Amy came for me to say Cecil is dying. I went over there. Dr. Boyd there says there is a glimmer of hope, very faint. Poor little fellow is weakening every hour, slowly dying out, exhausted. Oh my God, my poor wife and boy. Baby swallowed his last medicines at 7:30 p.m, then gasped for breath till 20 minutes to 11. I saw him, wife with me, draw last breath. Oh God." Now, this has a huge impact on Dyerson. He later writes, "I missed him everywhere." And he has pangs of guilt that he's caused the kid's death by not keeping his gutters clear. He even tells his friend George Lancel to look after his gutters. And the pain of Cyril's death lingered for years. In 1893, on the anniversary of Cecil's death, Dyerson took communion. This made him feel most unworthy. But, quote, "I take it in hope. 2 years ago my poor Cecil left. If no resurrection, why do we live? Poor baby boy had to save me the sins of the father." And the funeral of a niece's young child in December of that year brought memories of poor Cecil. And one way of celebrating death in the 19th century was to have memento mori. Here you can see a photograph that's taken of Cecil just after he died. Now, the house is where children died, but it's also the house at the place where adults died. And in 1887, there's a very vivid description in Dyerson's diary of his brother or his sister-in-law's husband, William Ray, dying. He did what most people of our age shouldn't do, is climb ladders. And again, I mean, that sense of having a body in a person's house, you can see by the last bit of that sort of slide, they actually go and view the body, and sort of biological changes are taking place in their house. Okay, now I just want to talk about servants. I think servants are absolutely an important part in a sort of 19th century household. In a house such as the one I showed you before of Conrad Hines, the butcher, its main brick rooms were a parlour, a dining room, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, and at the rear were the source of bath, store and washrooms. And there were 2 small weatherboard for his servants. Now servants, I think, play a vital part in a 19th century house. I live in a house with 14-foot ceilings. I never do anything about the cobwebs on the roof, on the ceilings. You know, to keep a house warm, fires have to be lit in the morning. There's an endless round of cleaning. And like the middle class everywhere, the Bendigo elite grumbled about their servants. To just give you a few quotes. Late in December 1883, Dyerson wrote, "Baby feverish, wife not well, little cooler. Did what I could. We want a servant badly. Not much time for reading or writing. No church. Wife is afraid to go. Tending to faint. Delightful cool breeze in night. Baby restless." In 1888, when Harriet's having another confinement, he has great servant problems. And on one occasion he writes, "Pinned out servant, find one who's been wearing my boots, pleasant." In mid-May he had to check the girls. They were up to 11:30 p.m, talking loudly and laughing. The following morning they were not awake till 7 a.m. However, his rudest shock came several days later when he found that his nurse girl had been drinking his whiskey. Oh, yeah. Now, for poor old Dyerson, it always appears that he has great trouble getting Harriet to sort of look after these servants well. And in 1893, he comes home from work. He lives in Alley Street. He works over in Fortuna, and he comes out and he finds his wife asleep after a row of the servants, and she'd retired to her bedroom, and Dyerson was livid. Tells me Mrs. Dyerson found fault with her. She's going next week. Been with us for 3 years. No time to leave. Wife is unable to come out of her room. Serve her right for not bridling her tongue. Girl is suffering from toothache. Nurse seems to repeat what wife tells her to the girl, who doesn't take it. Don't know what we shall do. Girl knows everything. A stranger will upset place and throw wife back. This all comes from a wretched cleaning of a room to prepare for her day at home. Girl took a long time to do it. Takes away my appetite. No dinner. I returned to office for afternoon. Did not see wife. Should have scolded her. Worked till 7 p.m. I suppose this is a sort of the minor problem with servants. There could be other problems. In 1891, Dyerson had to rebuke his daughter Amy, who had been helping a servant steal from drawers. But even more disturbing was when his nephew William Ray was flirting with servants, and such fears took a sort of more drastic turn 5 years later when Harriet Dyerson told her husband that she thought Willie Ray, her nephew, had married his mother's servant and was concealing it. That had set gossips off, and quote, everyone was talking of it. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I just want to talk about another aspect of I suppose, the middle class house, is that what you could do in a middle class house was entertain. And for the middle class in Bendigo in the 19th century, entertaining was very important. George Lancel, for example, in 1893, entertained no fewer than 200 people at Fortuna. On a smaller scale, Harriet Dyerson also did this. In 1893, Harriet entertained no fewer than 29 visitors, and putting on a show for visitors was important. And just as important for Harriet was how you got to your neighbour's house. And for years, Harriet bullies poor old Isaac into getting rid of the buggy that she uses to go visiting and getting a fight in, which he does in 1900. I think what's also important about middle class life in Bendigo is you can escape from Bendigo. And you can see from this quote that in, what's the date, I think in about 1900, Isaac Dyerson takes his family to the beach at Queenscliff. And going to Queenscliff was part of the ritual of middle class life. People seem to, I mean, the Dyerson family mixes in a very small circle. You meet that circle again when you go to the beach on holidays. You know, you take the train to Melbourne, catch the, I think it's at the Ozone out to Queenscliff, and in the case of Dyerson, he would often send his family to the beach for about a month, and that was very expensive. £70 to do that was, you know, over half the annual wage of a miner. I'm just going to finish off with a few little observations. This is the Dyerson family in the 1880s. I think, you know, even getting a photograph is part of that middle class ritual, all dressed up for the occasion. Here you can see the family very much involved in middle class entertainments. Harriet is on the horse in the middle, Amy's on a horse, and Clarence horse, and Emily on a bicycle. Very expensive pastimes. Also, I think with the middle class, you've got to sort of provide them for opportunities. The trouble with Bendigo is to get ahead in the world, you really have to leave the place. And in the case of the Dyerson family, Dyerson is convinced by Harriet to buy a house in St Kilda, best place to be in the early 20th century, and those children can then launch their lives in Melbourne. Amy marries a shirt manufacturer. Emily marries Sir Ernest Scott, the Professor of History at Melbourne University, and Clarence in the middle goes on to be one of the great sort of intellectuals in Australia between wars, a prominent stockbroker, and a friend of Prime Ministers. I've run out of time, so I'll leave it. I was just going to say something about poorer houses. I think in a sense, the role of a poorer house is basically to provide a bulwark against unemployment, and large houses you could sort of grow veggies. And in the case of this wonderful woman, Louise Oliver, whose husband is killed in a mine accident, she uses her inheritance to set up a dairy in Ironbark, and by sort of resilience and pluck, she's able to leave that house to her second husband for his life, and then to divide that amongst her children. So I'll leave it at that, as I've spoken too long.
This one's not working.
No, I can't get it working.
Sorry, I need to just repeat that.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. All right, thanks so much, Charles. So I'm going to take questions from the floor, but I'll probably try and repeat that question back just so our people on Zoom can actually hear the questions being asked. And if there's any questions from Zoom, you'll let me know. Right. So yeah, any questions from the floor to start this off?
I'm just wondering, Charles, have you looked at any families that may have had more intellectual pursuits, or like professional classes, things like that, and they're sort of merely sort of.
Well, yeah, I mean, Clarence fits that bill brilliantly.
So this is just a question about more intellectual, professional life and what.
Yeah,
is
I mean,
that?
I think the other important part about sort of middle class life in Bendigo is if you want to be a professional, you've got to leave the place. And a middle class family like the Dyersons are very much into music. So the eldest daughter, Emily, is a friend of Laurie Mueller, and together they go to they go to Germany to pursue their musical careers. Clarence Dyerson, if you read the diary, he tops all the subjects at St Andrews. He goes to Melbourne University, and again, that costs in the 19th century, about 50 or 60 pounds a year. And he becomes a mining engineer. Very good user of the Melbourne Public Library, where he puts his girlfriend to do research for him. But if you look at Clarence's diary, he's mixing with a lot of the Melbourne elite from Melbourne University. He's one of the first bushwalkers in the country. Quite a fascinating character. I once went to a friend's place in Kyneton, and he lived in the house of an old lawyer, and he had this lawyer's diary, and there in the diary was mentions of Clarence, this sort of social network. I think a place like Melbourne Uni was such a small place in the early 20th century, but all these people met one another and got on and did things together and stayed friends throughout their lives.
Question.
Charles, I'm just interested in the demographic, say, the difference between, say, places like Eagle Hawk, where I used to live, and, I don't know, Spring Gully or Quarry Hill. They were supposedly, what did you say, reasonable suburbs?
Yeah, Quarry Hill.
Can you repeat that? When you're on second, you repeat it. Charles. So ask you about demographics.
Oh, okay. The question was about sort of demographics of various divisions of Bendigo. Quarry Hill, it's another wonderful place. Quarry, Isaac Dyerson sort of passed Quarry Hill at one stage, and he said he noted that a lot of property was for sale there, and he hadn't bought any, and his mates had gone home to England, and he wished he'd had an advisor at that stage. Quarry Hill is just particularly residential.
Yeah.
It was one of the few areas in Bendigo that is just residential. You get streets that are residential, but as I say, just over the way you'll find mining. Around Girton, for example, you'll see the huge engineering works there. So the thing about Bendigo is in the centre. It's very mixed residential and sort of commercial and industrial, but it still is where the more expensive houses. Eagle Hawk, of course, has a mixture because it's got the sort of strip shopping centre there, but it is very heavily working class. It sort of really comes into its own, I suppose, towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, when the new moon mines boom. And it becomes the radical heart of Bendigo, where the great strike in, I think, 1910 sort of went for about 2 months, so.
It does have quite a few substantial buildings.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just thinking about probably the bias these days, like people would say to me, oh, you're living in Eagle Hawk, but it seems to have, before any bias, it seems to have had a village sort of distinction on its own as separate from Bendigo. So it seemed as though it was a place of reasonable quality to live in.
Well, yeah, but as I say, it does. By the end of the 19th century, it has the highest proportion of miners' residence areas because of the mining population.
Yeah.
But I think we've got to remember that a lot of these miners are men who have a great deal of a desire to be respectable. They are great churchgoers. they're great users of, I suppose, self-help, the lodges and things like this. So they're not, they're a sort of working class that's not, you know, not, I suppose in Marxist terms, it's not a lumpen proletariat. And I think those visions might have occurred when, I suppose, the centre of the city, a lot of middle class people after the war moved out to godforsaken places like Stratfieldsaye areas.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dick James had a question?
My question is in relation to the Rhodes Gallery that you put up, I think slide number 2 or 3.
Yeah.
You had Johann Ballestead. His assessment came in 1881, yet he died in
Oh, sorry,
1869.
to say 81 doesn't.
Yeah.
That's a misprint. It should be 1869, I think, or
Yeah,
71.
69 when he died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of interesting ones in that. If I can go back, you know, when you die is pretty important.
Certainly was.
Yeah, well, like if you look at Clark McGee, for example, or look at the Hunter brothers. You've got Joseph, who dies in 1871, worth only £4,000, but his brothers are quite rich squatters by the early 20th century. Well, he died just as his mines, and in particular the Garden Gully's about to boom. Yeah.
Just got a couple of questions on Zoom. Do you want to read them out?
There was one quick one. What was the name? The average age of the miners' wives when they got married, or the working class women?
About 22.
Yeah. All right.
Bendigo's, they're literally, I suppose one of the problems of Bendigo is there's literally nothing for women to do here. You know, there is no industry. There are no great sort of clothing factories or woolen mills like there are in Ballarat. So most women just I suppose in their young years sort of work in their homes with their mothers. And they go to Melbourne in lesser numbers than their brothers do. So, sort of Bendigo's a bit like a sort of English coal mining community, except they both have very few opportunities for women and very high fertility rates well into the 20th century.
We had another question online.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
there's another one. This is more of a comment than a question, but from Elizabeth. Thomas Harvey was my great-great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather of my husband. Wife's name was Elizabeth, or I know his wife's name was Eliza. And I think there's actually a photo of them outside of their stone cottage out at Harveytown in Eagle Hawk.
Yeah, I've recently been given their sort of medical almanacs. And because I think Liza, her husband, suffered from fits, epilepsy. But with that stone house, I'm sorry I didn't show you a picture, but they had the most amazing gardens out there. I mean, they were on occasions selling, 160 poultry a week. They had a fruit wagon which they took through the streets of Eagle Hawk. So I think what their case shows is that these properties are very important for self-sustaining in times of unemployment, in times of trouble. Yeah. I'm right.
You're right.
Yeah.
I think we're about being just on time, 6:30. So we do need to finish up. But I'm sure you're welcome to come and talk to Charles if you've got questions afterwards. Thanks again, those of us on Zoom, and do look out for our next Discovering History seminar, which Tammy, it's November, right, Tammy? Our next one. Yeah, when we have our we had to postpone our event that was for Anzac Day on around the Diggers Memorial, so we will be having that again. Look out for that in November. So thanks so much again, Charles, and thanks everyone for joining us today.